Hello, you beautiful creatures.
Welcome to Frass Happens, a podcast where we teach you shit about insects. I'm your host, Casey.
And I'm your host, Katie. Before we get started today, we wanted to give a big thank you to you all for bearing with us as we get the hang of this whole podcast thing. If you couldn't tell, we had a lot to say in episode 3, which is why we had to quickly improvise our first two-parter. Moving forward, we plan on our episodes being a lot shorter and following a more consistent format. As you probably noticed in these first few introductory episodes, we've shared the research and hosting responsibilities, but in the future, Casey and I will trade off taking the lead on researching and narrating these topics to bring you more concise episodes.
Which is why today we are so excited to bring you our first normal episode. Today, I'll be chatting about an insect group that we are both incredibly familiar with, and I have a feeling a lot of our listeners are pretty familiar with it too.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to be talking about native bees today.
Woo!
And of course, we can't talk about native bees without also digging into the very misunderstood and controversial topic of honeybee beekeeping in North America. This is one of the topics that is near and dear to both of our hearts, but is also the source of a lot of our frustrations.
Mm-hmm.
Katie, I don't know about you, but anytime I am out somewhere where there's also the public,
Yup.
and I'm doing bee surveys with my insect net, so many people will stop us to ask us, what are you doing? A lot of times they go, catching butterflies, and then we'll go, no, native bees. But a lot of times that conversation goes in like one of two directions, which is where someone tells me about a time that they got stung by a bunch of yellow jackets, or they tell me about their mom or their aunt or their brother or their cousin who beekeeps. Mm-hmm. And they're like, oh, my so-and-so keeps honeybees. And I go, oh, well, we're actually looking at everything but honeybees.
Yep.
Which, it does open the door for some on-the-spot outreach, which is great. Some people are really, kind of into it, and I can have a little bit of a conversation. I'm like, wow, bees are actually so much more diverse. And then other times people just want to talk about honeybees, and I kind of just go with the flow and go back to work.
I know, it's such a tough thing where you don't want to burst anyone's bubble, because you can tell they're so excited to share this with you and find this point of connection. And the cool thing is there is a point of connection there. It's just, I think, more nuanced than people realize, which you're going to explain all about today.
Yeah, it just goes to show us that there is still such a need for science communication, especially when it comes to the topic of bees and native bees and pollinators in general.
Absolutely, especially because people have such a sort of broad view of them, and a lot of people, I think, think they know a lot about them.
Yes.
And then once you start digging into it, they're like, oh, there's actually a lot that I didn't realize was at play here.
Right, there are so many myths out there, misconceptions, and people are just gonna, think they know what they think they know.
Exactly. Well, Casey, I'm so pumped. I feel like we've literally been waiting years to release this episode, and it's finally time. So take it away.
Like we mentioned in the introduction, today we are going to be talking all about bees. A little bit of a native bee crash course for you, if you will. But before we get into the nitty-gritty and all of the details surrounding our native bees, let's talk about why we should even care about pollinators. Well, pollinators pollinate. Okay.
The end. That was incredible.
Pollination is an essential ecosystem service that is provided by a variety of different animals out there. Pollination is required for plants to produce seeds or fruits. So you wouldn't have apples if the apple flower did not get pollinated. You wouldn't have blueberries if the blueberry flower didn't get pollinated. Pollination is essentially moving the pollen from the male reproductive parts of a flower to the female reproductive parts of the flower, which allow that flower to reproduce. Animal pollination is essential for 13 different crop species, including cacao, squashes and pumpkins, vanilla, watermelon, cantaloupe. So if you like any of those, they 100% rely on animal pollination. Many crops are also partially dependent on animal pollination, or the presence of pollinators significantly increases fruit set. So things like almonds, apples, blueberries, cherries, cranberries, tomatoes, eggplants, peaches, cucumbers, peppers, and 100+ other crops are partially dependent on animal pollination. And what this really means is that these crops do so much better when they are pollinated by animals. Technically, for example, blueberries can self-pollinate, but your berries are going to be much smaller and you're going to have fewer of them on your blueberry bush. So for increased fruit set, increased fruit size, you want to be having animal pollination with these crops.
Yeah, that was like a huge part of my PhD research was literally looking at pollinator dependence in different crops in Ireland. So we looked at 2 cultivars of apples and 1 cultivar of beans. And yeah, it's really interesting to see how different flower morphologies respond to pollinators visiting them in terms of how it actually affects their reproduction. There are some that like you really need someone coming to visit, while others it's like, maybe.
Yeah.
Like it might make it a little better, but if they don't show up, it's okay.
Yeah, we can self-pollinate and figure it out. Watch me, have all of these little pollen grains fall onto my own reproductive parts.
Exactly. Oh, there are a lot of I was about to say like masturbatory flowers, but that's not
These
right.
flowers keep masturbating in front of me.
What are we gonna do about these masturbated flowers? Anyway, back to you.
There's this phrase that has been widely misinterpreted and spread, that 1/3 of our total diet is dependent either directly or indirectly upon insect-pollinated plants. So, like we just talked about, something like blueberries, tomatoes, apples, that is going to be directly pollinated, or, it's directly dependent on insect-pollinated plants. However, something like carrots, for example, we're not eating the actual fruit or the outcome of pollination, right? A carrot is going to be like the tuber of the carrot plant. But in order to plant more carrots, you need to have carrot seeds. And in order to get carrot seeds, you need to have pollination. And so that's what we mean by indirectly, right? So again, 1/3 of our total diet is dependent either directly, like apples, or indirectly, like carrots, on insect-pollinated plants.
And if you're a horse, you're happy about both.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm a goober today.
No, I love it, as you should be. I will just say briefly that this gets miscited all of the time, especially in the media and in different journal articles, where it's often said that 1 of every 3 bites of food on your plate is because of honeybees. And so this is me just kind of also clarifying, because no, it's not just honeybees, it is all insects that pollinate. And it's like 1/3 of our diet, but it depends on what your diet looks like, So, anyway, just clarifying that up. 1/3 of our total diet is dependent either directly or indirectly upon insect-pollinated plants.
I feel like that's like a very typical, like, I don't know, like gardener blog, like highlight.
Yeah.
Like you see that type of thing a lot. And I think like pollination, pollinators in general, that's where you see a lot of this misinformation get spread, especially like on Facebook and these sort of like little sound bites that people latch onto.
Yeah.
But there are other sound bites you can latch onto that are correct.
Yeah, people just really love that, like, one of every 3 bites of food on your plate.
Mm-hmm.
And that one just has been widely cited and spread, and it's not quite correct. It's close, but it's not quite correct. So
Close
here's
but
me
bad.
correcting that. Well, like we just said, right? A lot of these crops are being pollinated by insects. May I say insects, not just bees, because a variety of insects pollinate. In fact, 80% of the world's flowering plants require animal pollination, so it's not just the crops that we eat, but it's also the wildflowers that help to make up, rich biodiversity in different ecosystems. And these are also going to be relying on animals to pollinate them. And there's a variety of animals that are out there pollinating. Besides bees, we have flies that are incredible pollinators out there. A lot of them are going to be in the family Syrphidae, which are syrphid flies or flower flies that kind of mimic bees a lot of the times. So flies are incredibly important pollinators. Beetles are super important pollinators. They're actually often called the forgotten pollinators because a lot of times, especially gardeners, are going to be thinking of beetles as pests, right? They're chewing the leaves, they're chewing the flower petals, making things ugly, if you will. But actually, beetles are, some of the first pollinators that are out there.
Yeah.
There are more than 77,000 species of beetles that visit flowers. Beetles visit nearly 90% of all flowering plants, so they're going to be interacting with a wide variety of plant species.
Yeah, and they also were some of the first that we saw in the fossil record as being pollinators. They were like literally the first pollinators that started, animal pollination.
And I encourage you to spend some time looking at who's visiting your flowers, and especially if you're listening to this when this comes out, we're about to be getting into goldenrod season in the fall, and just watching the variety of beetles that are visiting goldenrod and getting absolutely covered in pollen is
Hmm.
really fun to see. So don't forget your beetles, they're really important pollinators. Moths and butterflies are also some classic pollinators. Moths, we do have some day flying moths, but a lot of them are nocturnal, and so they're doing a lot of pollination at night. Butterflies do tend to be not as good of pollinators as some of these others because they are on these big stalk-like legs, so their body actually really isn't interacting with the pollen too much, but they can also pollinate. We also have wasps that are incredible pollinators. So a variety of different types of wasps are going to be on flowers. Adult wasps nectar on flowers, and so they're constantly interacting with the reproductive parts of flowers.
Man, I love a good wasp. Oh, they are so beautiful and so misunderstood. Justice for wasps.
Justice for wasps. And before we get into bees, I also want to talk about our non-insect pollinators. A lot of you probably know that bats are some of, the most important pollinators out there, especially if you like tequila. Bats
Hmm.
are the main pollinator of agave, which is the plant that is used to produce tequila. So if you like tequila, you should be supporting bats conservation.
We need a t-shirt.
Yeah, right? Sometimes mammals are also pollinators. Little field mice can interact with flowers and eat the pollen because it's a good source of protein, or maybe they're just hanging out in the flowers. Birds can also pollinate. Lizards can pollinate. And there is actually a recent paper that came out showing that the Ethiopian wolf is a pollinator of this one particular flower in Ethiopia. And so this Ethiopian wolf will lick the flower to get the nectar, and potentially the pollen too. And in doing so, its muzzle gets completely covered in pollen, and then it goes to other flowers, and so that's also a pollinator, and it's one of the first recorded large carnivores that's a pollinator.
I love the pictures of them doing this too. They just look like the happiest little pups. Like, oh, I'm having my
And the
treat.
flowers are so wild too. They are like this yellow orange bristle stalk thing on a stalk. I don't know.
Hmm.
They're crazy looking. Look up the pictures of Ethiopian wolves pollinating the plant because it is so cool.
You won't regret it.
So, All of these animals are pollinators of different wildflowers and crops out there, but bees are some of the most efficient pollinators, and so we often think of bees when we think of pollination. Let's talk about why bees are some of the most efficient pollinators. And in order to do that, we first actually have to talk about what a bee is and what they're up to out there. Bees are in the order Hymenoptera, and Hymenoptera includes bees, wasps, ants, and sawflies, so these are all closely related to one another. And there are 7 different families of bees in the world: Apidae, Halictidae, Andrenidae, Megachilidae, Caletidae, Stenotritidae, and Melididae.
That sounded so pretty all together. I don't think I've ever heard them all listed, and that's so sweet.
Yeah! So those 7 families are the families of bees in the order Hymenoptera. So bees evolved from wasps. One of the differences between bees and wasps, if you look underneath the microscope, is that wasps are going to have unbranched hairs, so hairs on their bodies that are just like a single strand. But bees, on the other hand, will have branched hairs. They almost look like little tiny Christmas trees underneath the microscope. And so if you're not really sure what you're looking at, and you're in the lab and you have access to a microscope, if you pop that insect underneath and you see these branched hairs, you know that it's going to be a bee rather than a wasp.
Even a little lens, if you're out in the field, sometimes you can see those differences as well.
Both bees and wasps will visit flowers, and they're both visiting flowers to eat nectar. So adult bees and adult wasps nectar on flowers to get carbohydrates or sugars, and that's the source of energy for these adult insects. However, when we look at what the larvae are eating, this is where things get a little bit different. So wasp larvae eat meat. This could be caterpillars, spiders, crickets, grasshoppers, a little bit of your ham sandwich, perhaps. But bees are basically vegetarian wasps. Instead of their larvae consuming meat as their protein source, they actually consume pollen. And so female bees are the ones going out to collect pollen to bring back to their nest, whatever that might look like, and they're going to be feeding their babies this protein source of pollen instead of meat. So branched hairs, larvae consume pollen. That's really the biggest difference between a bee and a wasp. And bees are basically just the vegetarian cousins of wasps.
Casey, have you ever had people ask you about like protein content in pollen? I definitely have gotten that question before where people are like, if I eat pollen, is that a good protein source for me? I'm like, you'd have to eat a lot of pollen for it to be significant for a human.
Yeah, I would suggest getting your protein source from something different, because I wouldn't want to be consuming that much pollen.
That sounds terrible. I feel like that's like the cinnamon challenge, only like worse.
Yeah. Also, a quick note here, bees don't know that they're pollinators, right? There's no such thing as like a good bee or a good insect because it knows it's a pollinator. It has no idea that it is helping a flower, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's collecting pollen for selfish reasons. It's collecting the pollen because that is what it feeds its baby. It's going out into the landscape and stealing a resource to feed its baby. So there's no such thing as a good pollinator and a bad pollinator in that sense, because bees don't know that they're doing this. They're not doing it on purpose to be good. They're doing it, again, just because that's what they feed their babies.
And what a wonderful coincidence that is. I mean, not quite coincidence. Coevolution is a real thing. But, like, I feel like that almost makes it more magical that they're not doing it on purpose, and yet still this whole ecosystem service relies on them.
Yeah, exactly. Because bees have these branched hairs and tend to be quite hairy compared to some of these other insects like wasps, flies, and beetles, and because they are purposefully collecting the pollen and moving it around onto their bodies and then visiting other flowers, this is what makes them some of the most effective pollinators out there. So, what comes to mind when I say bee? So, if you're imagining honey or honeybees or beekeeping, this is actually just one species of bee if you're in North America. This is going to be Apis mellifera, which is the European honeybee. And bees are so much more diverse than just honeybees.
Mm-hmm.
We have bees of all shapes and sizes and colors. In North America, north of Mexico, there are around 4,000 different species of bees. And in the world, there are approximately 20,000 species of bee.
I love them. So many.
A lot of times when I give talks, I like to start them off by asking the crowd how many different species they think are in Rhode Island. And again, Rhode Island is the smallest state in the United States. And a lot of times the count starts off somewhere around 7 to 10.
Oh yeah.
So it'll be like 10. And then eventually someone jokingly is like 200. And I'm like, it's actually more than that.
Yep. Yeah, that was actually another part of my PhD research, was doing a public perception survey where we were asking Irish citizens how many bee species they thought were native to Ireland. And we have about 100 bee species in Ireland. And most people guessed around like between 3 and 10.
Yeah, most people will think of a honeybee, a bumblebee. Maybe they know of some others. Maybe they're thinking about a yellow jacket, which is a wasp, not a bee.
Mm-hmm.
But really, yeah, a lot of the things that are bees, most people think are flies.
Oh, absolutely. And I think sometimes also people think like there's one bumblebee. You know, when I tell people,
Right.
you know, there's 13 species of bumblebee you can find in Maine, they're like, wait, it's not just the bumblebee? I'm like, yeah, no, there's different species. Just like any other
46 in North America.
Yeah.
So bees are diverse as different species, but they're also diverse in their sizes, in their sociality, so how they live and exist with one another, their nesting behavior, and their diet breadth, what they're foraging on. And differences in these life history traits have been shown to affect how bees can respond to environmental change. So some bees are doing really well right now, while others are struggling, declining drastically, and even going extinct before our very eyes.
Mm.
So in terms of size, bumblebees and carpenter bees are some of the largest bees that we have, at least in Katie and I's region here in New England. So something like a carpenter bee is about an inch long. That's around like 20 to 25 millimeters in length. But some of our smallest bees, these are going to be in the genus Perdita, which are called fairy bees, can be like 2 millimeters long. That is so incredibly... It's like a speck flying in the wind.
I know. I feel like so many people see them and assume, like you said before, like, is that a fly?
Yeah. Bees are also incredibly diverse in other morphological features, like their color. So we have, big fluffy yellow and black bees like bumblebees, but we have other bees that are red and yellow. We have bees that are race car green and metallic. We have metallic blue bees. Basically anything and any color that you can think of out there might just be a bee in that color.
Mm-hmm.
And contrary to popular belief, most bees do not live in large colonies. A lot of people have heard about queen bees, and worker bees, and that's true for some species, and these are the eusocial species. So these are things like honeybees and bumblebees that are eusocial, that live in these colonies and just have a single reproductive queen. But most of our bees out there are solitary. 90% of all of the bees in the world are solitary nesting. And these are kind of like the single moms out there. They do all of the work. So it's just one female who makes a nest or finds a nest, provisions it with pollen to feed her baby, because remember, that's the protein source for developing bee larvae. She's going to lay an egg on that pollen provisioning and do that again and again, and maybe make like 20 to 30 little brood cells in her lifetime before she dies, which normally most lifespans of these bees are really only a couple weeks out of the year. So now we know that most bees don't live in big colonies, and something like a bumblebee or a yellow jacket, which is a wasp, those animals that live in these big colonies will actively defend that colony because their family is in there and their food's in there. But a solitary bee is just going to either go back into her nest and hide, or fly away and come back later when you're not there. You're highly unlikely to get stung by anything that is solitary nesting, whether it is a bee or a wasp.
Yeah, this is something I say to people who get really worried about ground bees all the time because they'll find these, as I'm sure you're going to explain in a second, aggregations of ground nesting bees, and they'll want to like call pest control because they're like, "Oh, it's going to sting my kids, it's going to sting my dog." I'm like the bees that you see flying around are most likely just males waiting for females and they can't sting you.
Yes, yeah, a couple different things there. So, first off, males can't sting. So it's only females that sting because a stinger is a modified ovipositor, and an ovipositor is an egg-laying device. And so that stinger has evolved from the egg-laying device as a sort of, individual protective system. But a lot of these bees are highly unlikely to sting you. And when you do see these large ground nesting aggregations, it's often, like Katie said, the males that are flying around. And so they're not able to even hurt you. They're just gonna buzz at you.
It's such a badass evolutionary story of like, yeah, I used to lay eggs with this, but now I use it to fight.
Now I have a knife on my butt.
Knife butt, knife butt.
Also, another quick aside. A lot of people think that bees can only sting you once, and this is really only true for honeybees. So just in case, I want to clear up that myth out there while we're kind of on the subject of stinging insects. Honeybees have a barbed stinger, so it's kind of like a fish hook if you think of it that way. So once it stings you, it actually pulls the stinger out, and its organs come out with it, which is why honeybees die after stinging you when their stinger comes out with them. But most bees have a smooth stinger, and wasps, and so they are able to sting you multiple times. I once had a bumblebee get stuck in my dress at work when I was waitressing outside, and I think I got stung like 8 or 9 times.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, that one wasn't fun. But, she was stuck. I totally get it. It wasn't her fault and it wasn't my fault.
Just
I tried to
very
get it out
unfortunate
as fast
for
as I
both
could.
parties.
Yeah. So back to our native bees here. Let's talk about how they nest and where they nest. 70% of all bees are ground nesting. Katie just had mentioned this a moment ago, but most of our bees will be making nests themselves in the ground. Some bees are really, really good at digging. In fact, we have a whole group of bees called digger bees. We have other bees that are called mining bees, and these all nest in the ground. The structure of the nest inside the ground can look different depending on the species. They also go different depths. There's one recorded nest that was excavated, and it's equivalent to a 6-foot-tall human digging down into the dirt a length of 4 football fields.
Oh my gosh. What?
So she made an incredibly deep nest. It was like a couple feet deep, I think, into the ground. But most of these nests are just going to be a couple inches to like 10 inches, 12 inches into the ground. But again, totally species dependent.
Yeah, good job, baby.
And oftentimes in these nests, what you get are these little offshoots. And so they have a main tunnel and then these offshoots where they prepare a brood cell. They'll bring pollen back, make their pollen provisioning or like a pollen ball in there, lay an egg on it, seal up that brood cell, and then go and do it again. And like I mentioned before, a lot of these bees that are solitary nesting and nesting in the ground only make about 20 to 30 individuals. And most of these are also univoltine, which means there's just one generation per year. This can change depending on where you are, based on latitude and altitude, but this means that the species emerges, they mate, they produce a bunch of babies, they die, and then we don't see that species again until that next generation comes out the following year. 70% of the bees nest in the ground. Where are the other ones nesting? So a lot of these are going to be cavity nesters, but we also have some bees that nest in rotting wood or other types of wood. You're probably most familiar with something like a carpenter bee that might be nesting in your porch or the eaves of your house that will actually drill out holes and tunnels into wood that they like and make their nests inside there. Agachlora pura, which is one of those race car green, pure green sweat bees. They like to also nest in rotting wood. So they're not actively digging out tunnels in your house, but they will find something like a rotting log in the woods and make their nest inside there, which is really fun because sometimes on iNaturalist, I see people posting a photo of a green bee amongst rotting wood. And I can get that one to species without even thinking about it because it's really just Agachlora pura that nests like that around here. But around 30% of all of the other bees are going to be cavity nesters. Some bees, like small carpenter bees, nest in twigs. So these are our twig nesting species. They're going to be utilizing hollow stems, so plants that have like very soft, pithy stems or are completely hollow inside, like Monarda, hyssop, mountain mints, rubus, which are like your raspberries and other brambles like that. They're going to be utilizing these stems in order to make their nests, and they look a little bit different from the nests of ground nesting species. Because they're working in this stem, they make a series of brood cells throughout that stem. They start down low, they're going to bring back pollen, lay an egg on it, and then they close it off, a lot of times using kind of the pithy substance from within that stem to kind of make this particle partition. And then they make another brood cell, partition it off, make another brood cell, partition it off, and so on until you have a stem of like 10 plus bees sometimes.
And it's really cool too. They're so smart in the way that they organize these little brood cells because they actually put all of the females at the back and all of the males at the front. So when they all emerge in the spring, there are males that are kind of waiting for the females. How do they know?
It is species specific which ones go at the front, but the majority are males at the front. And so the males come out a couple days before the females. They disperse to prevent inbreeding a little bit.
Thank goodness.
And then, yeah, they'll kind of be like hanging around waiting for the females to show up a couple days later.
And that's why, like, often the first bees that you see in the spring are just like males hanging out. So you might see them like landing on warm spaces, just kind of trying to keep warm, trying to keep fed while they wait for the ladies to arrive.
Yeah, sunning their little bee tushies on a leaf in the sun or something.
Their little mustaches glinting in the light.
So if you're a bee and you're not nesting in the ground and you're not nesting in a hollow twig, you might be nesting in another type of cavity. This could be a cavity in the ground, it could be a cavity in a stone wall, it could be a cavity that a beetle bored into a tree. It could be a man-made cavity as well. Some of the most common cavity nesters that we see are mason bees and leafcutter bees. And these are aptly named because mason bees will go out and collect mud to line their brood cells and partition in between their brood cells in this cavity. And leafcutter bees will go and use their big, strong mandibles to cut pieces of leaves and then line their brood cells with that. And there are even some leafcutter bees that will collect flower petals to line their brood cells. And so you get these beautiful brood cells that are like pink and purple, and it's just so cute to see. So these are also some of our cavity nesters out there.
And it's so cool to see them flying with these pieces of leaves or petals. They are like little witches on brooms.
Yeah. They really are. Just like, look what I have.
I got a leaf, bringing it home. Gonna wallpaper my house.
And so if you also are checking out the leaves in your garden and you see these perfect like C-shaped circles cut out, it's probably a leafcutter bee. So bee hotels are really hot right now. Every garden center or like kind of cute little natural hippie store tends to have these bee hotels for sale. And you can also make these as a craft with kids, or you see these people making like gigantic sheds that are basically just one big giant bee hotel. And I just want to talk about them really quickly here. Like we just learned, the vast majority of our bees don't nest in cavities like this. They're nesting in the ground, they're nesting in twigs. And so you're only going to be supporting a small percentage of bees by purchasing and hanging up these bee hotels or creating them on your property. And there's a lot of issues with them as well. I would implore you to take some time to research them if you do have these bee hotels up or you're thinking of purchasing one or creating one. Some are better than others, but ones that are really big that you cannot clean out, I would have to say you should be getting rid of those and not creating those. You're going to be bringing in all different sorts of pathogens. You're going to be attracting parasitoids and predators to the area, and it's just really not a good system to have long term.
Is Minty snoring?
Yeah, can you hear him?
Yeah.
My cat is currently purring and snoring near the microphone, so if you hear something, it's my cat. His name is Minty.
Minty boy. I have heard those snores next to my ear many a time.
He's snoozing so hard, and I don't want to wake him up because he's real cute about it.
Sweetest baby. And one last thing before we move on about bee hotels. I often tell people, when you get a bee hotel, yeah, bees will probably maybe live in it. But what you're really doing is maybe building a bird feeder, because if a bird comes along and sees this like whole group of larva filled like tubes, they're like, oh, this is great. I'm just going to eat all of these right now. So, I mean, if you're looking to build a bird feeder, that might be more successful.
Or if you're looking to like watch some really cool predator prey interactions.
Yeah. So, I mean, like, you could still get it, but it might not help the species that you thought you were going to help.
Yeah, they became really hot before like the research caught up with it.
Mhm.
And so people just kind of were like, bee hotels, save the bees, put this bee hotel out. But they actually support exotic bee species more than they do our native bee species. And we have a few up at my lab that I always watch when I'm walking my dog around the fields. And I've seen grass wasps making nests in there, mason bees making nests in there, leafcutter bees. And then I come back a few weeks later and the entire nest has been decimated by ants or earwigs, or there's jumping spiders that have caught somebody. Like, it can really just become a hotspot for different predators. And again, if you're not able to clean them out each year, you're just going to be allowing different pests and pathogens to spread from generation to generation. So it's a cool educational tool in certain garden settings, but it's not really an effective conservation tool for bees. So just keep that in mind.
Especially because the bees do it best. This is not the habitat that they need. They know how to build their own nests.
When possible, natural is always going to be better than something that is a synthetic nest source.
Guys, Casey just pulled up a slide that just says an aside about the fucking Mason Bee companies. This is so in all caps. This is so aggressive.
If you're listening,
I'm so ready. Go off.
If you're listening and you follow me on Instagram, you already know that I have been so heated about this for a while now. But there are all these companies that are selling mason bees and leafcutter bees, which are those cavity nesting species, throughout like North America. So like there's one company that's in California that's selling them. There's one company that's in Canada that's selling them throughout North America. But a lot of times the companies that are selling these bees are selling non-native species. These are bees that were likely imported here for their pollination services. There's a setting and a time and a place where these bees do serve a really important pollination service to certain crops. Like the alfalfa leafcutter bee is really great for alfalfa production. They are incredibly efficient pollinators of alfalfa. Honeybees cannot compete with them. And so there's these companies that are selling these non-native species saying like, oh, release these pollinators into your garden. How magical, how wonderful. But all you're doing is bringing in a non-native species and releasing them when you could have 20, 30, 80 different species of bees already existing in your space that you could be supporting. And by releasing these commercially reared insects, the chances of spreading pathogens into the environment is so much higher. And we learned about this from commercially reared bumblebees in the endangered species episode that we just did. The commercially reared bumblebees were spreading Nosema bombi, which decimated Bombus affinis and other closely related species and caused them to be on the brink of extinction.
Yeah, it's basically, if you remember what we said in our last episode on the rusty patched bumblebee, if you can buy an insect online, it means you shouldn't put it outside
Yeah, agree.
for the most part, unless you like have a very specific reason, like Casey was saying about like alfalfa production. But if you're like, oh, this just might be fun, don't do it. And that includes those butterfly kits. So sorry to
Yes.
burst your bubble. Please stop releasing those.
Right, because you're bringing something in with genetics from a different location. And also, if you're purchasing bees, even if they are native from a different area, that's basically like poaching. Like like they're poaching these insects,
Yeah.
breeding them, and then selling them to you for a profit. Just support the insects that are already existing in your space. It's a much better use of
Yeah.
your money, I promise. Thanks for listening to all of that, everybody. Going back to native bee diversity, I just want to talk for a little bit about diet breath. Diet breath, which is, what these animals might be feeding on, have different restrictions. There can be physical restrictions, like the tongue length or the size of the bee doesn't correlate to the flower structure or the flower size, right? Something that is like a kind of tubular flower where the nectar's at the base, you either need to have a very small body to be able to crawl inside that flower with your whole body to get to the nectar, or you need to have a long enough tongue to reach that. But if you're in between those two, you might not be visiting that flower, and so that might not be something that is on your list of flowers that you visit. Another way that diet breath can be restricted is by foraging distances. So there is a relationship between the body size of bees and the bee foraging ranges. It's not a perfect correlation, but generally speaking, small bees fly shorter distances to forage than larger bees. For example, bumblebees can travel like 1,000 meters or like a kilometer in a diameter around their nest in order to forage on different flowers. But something like one of those twig nesting species really only forages like 100 meters or so. And that's not very far.
Mm-mm.
If they don't have enough food and the right food around their nest site, they're not going to be able to produce a new generation. Another thing in regard to diet breath is the difference between generalists and specialists. So generalist species are a bee species that's going to be foraging on a variety of things and collecting a variety of things as their pollen source to feed their brood. Specialist species, however, will only collect pollen from a particular plant family, related genera, or even sometimes a single plant species. So if that flower disappears or is outside their foraging range, that bee is also going to disappear because they don't have the proper source of pollen to feed their larvae. Around 25% of the 800 species of bees that are native to the eastern United States are pollen specialists. We have some that will visit a whole genus, so something like Melisodes desponsus. They are a thistle specialist, so they will visit any flower in the Cirsium genus. There's also a Pontidaria specialist, and so Pontidaria is pickerel weed. That's that purple flower on a stalk that grows at the edges of ponds and some lakes. And so there's a bee that literally only collects pollen from that pickerel weed flower and has to also therefore nest nearby lakes and ponds in order to get its pollen source. So there are all sorts of different pollen specialists out there. And again, if they don't have the flower, their babies will not be able to develop properly and you will not get another generation of the species.
And not only are there specialist bees out there, the logic is also flipped for flowers. There are some flowers that are really easy to pollinate. Think of like an apple flower. It's wide open, anyone can land on it and get covered in pollen. But there are other flowers, maybe like a bean flower, that has a more closed body shape. And so it requires a really special pollinator to be able to push down on the keel petal to sort of open it up and reveal its reproductive structures. So a flower like that would need a really big, heavy pollinator with a longer tongue in order to get in there and actually interact with the reproductive structures. And that's why it's really important that we have this wide diversity of bees and other pollinators, because not every flower can be pollinated by every insect.
And also, honeybees are oftentimes so much less efficient at pollinating than our native species.
They have way fewer special powers than a lot of our more magical native species.
We're not biased at all.
Not even a little bit.
Well, now that we've covered our little native bee crash course, let's get sad and talk about some of the challenges and threats to these native bees. One of the biggest threats that our bees are facing is habitat loss and habitat fragmentation. It's also the loss of rare habitats and quality habitat that we're seeing that's going to be really impacting these species. If you think of a rug, and then you cut up that rug into a whole bunch of different pieces, and then start to take those pieces away, and you're just left with a couple scraps, that's what we kind of mean when we talk about habitat fragmentation. So instead of having this beautiful landscape where you can move throughout it and you have safety throughout it and food throughout it, you're now left with just these little pockets of potential habitat where you could live. And we see this happening in real time with urbanization, development, agricultural intensification, right? All of these things are limiting the amount of natural wild spaces for these insects and other wildlife. They're completely changing the quality of the habitat. You know, we're taking out all of these native species and then putting in Bradford pears.
Yep.
And so losing these important habitats is really the biggest threat to our bees. The other thing with fragmentation is that a lot of these bees that can only travel so far in a single lifespan, right, they need to have this connectivity. And so by cutting up the landscape and only having these pockets of green space, we're really limiting the movement of these species. We're limiting the gene flow that could be happening throughout different populations because they're not able to move and interact with one another. And so that's going to weaken the genetics and just weaken the ability of these animals to survive in the long run.
Yeah, unfortunately, humans really like pavement and monocultures.
Boy, do we. And with a lot of these at-risk species or declining species of bees, we're seeing these range constrictions where, you know, they used to live in these whole wide spaces and now they're just living in some small pockets throughout that range. So instead of being widespread throughout, now they're just existing in a couple small populations throughout it. Agricultural intensification is another big threat. And this goes hand in hand to some degree with habitat loss and habitat fragmentation, but especially in areas out in, like, you know, the Midwest or on the West Coast where a lot of crops are grown, you can see these large fields of monoculture, like Katie had just kind of mentioned, where nothing's able to exist in there, right? You don't have a diversity of plants to support native insects and other wildlife. And also, a lot of these agricultural fields are going to be using pesticides. Another big threat to our native bee species. So these could be pesticides in these large agricultural settings, but they're also the pesticides that are being used in your yard and in your neighborhoods. It's not just insecticides, which kill insects, that are going to be harming our bees. It's also herbicides, miticides, fungicides. There's a lot of new research coming out that's showing the impact of fungicides on bees, and it's not really great.
Nope.
So there are so many different ways that these chemicals can be impacting the bees, and there's different sources for how they can reach our bees too. A lot of the chemicals that are used with mosquito fogging and tick spraying can affect other beneficial insects too. And a lot of these companies aren't really properly trained with the pesticides that they're using and will spray them on open blooms, for example, and potentially be killing or harming all of the pollinators that are out there pollinating your flowers and your crops. The other thing is that this spraying doesn't really do anything to control the populations of these potentially harmful groups of invertebrates, whether they're ticks or mosquitoes. you're not really going to ever be able to control the mosquito population by spraying your yard. They're going to just fly in from nearby. There are other ways that you can protect yourself rather than spraying your whole yard with a pesticide.
It's much more effective to use bug spray, to wear long sleeve clothes, to check yourself for ticks, things like that, than to try and modify your environment. You're more likely to just throw things out of whack and still have the same problem that you had before.
Exactly. Yeah. Control your own body, make those modifications to your own body, and stop mosquito fogging, please.
Please.
Another big threat to our native bees is the presence of invasive species. So this could be invasive plant species that are outcompeting the important native species that would have existed in that space. Things like Japanese knotweed, oriental bittersweet can really choke out and overshadow and take away nutrients from all sorts of native vegetation. So if you have invasive species on your property, I would implore you to look into the destruction of that invasive species. And the removal of invasive species is one case where chemical herbicides and other treatments might actually be necessary, and it might be better for the environment in the long run.
There are some pretty sustainable ways that you can use, especially herbicides. Like you might have heard of like the cut and dab method. That's a great way to make sure that, these pesticides aren't being used more than they need to. You're using literally the smallest possible amount to kill just this one species.
There are also some invasive and non-native animals that have been introduced to North America in particular that I want to talk about. So there are some non-native and exotic bee species that kind of have snuck over here in one way or another. For example, there's one species called the giant resin bee, Megachile sculpturalis, and this will actively kick our native carpenter bees out of their nests. So sometimes there's some direct competition in that way. But this is where I'm now going to talk about honeybees. Honeybees are not technically an invasive species in North America, but they are a non-native species here in North America. Honeybees, the ones that we see beekeepers working with, is only one species, and that species is the European honeybee, Apis mellifera. They were brought over in the 1600s by colonists and have persisted ever since. They are intricately intertwined with how our agricultural system is set up. However, they are not part of the natural history of North America. They were not here. They are not meant to be here. And there's a lot of different ways that they interact with our native bees and can negatively impact our native bees. And this is where I get really annoyed because I recently found out that certain beekeeping groups have been promoting beekeeping to the public by saying that there is a pollinator deficit out there. And so they should be releasing more honeybees into the environment because the crops and wildflowers in the environment don't have enough pollinators to pollinate them.
Oh, that makes me so angry.
That's just like not the way that should be advertised at all.
No, it should not.
We have plenty of pollinators still out there. Are they in trouble? A lot of them, yes. But we have plenty of pollinators out there, and introducing a non-native species is not the way to protect your pollinators.
Especially when that non-native species also has negative effects on our native species.
Right, and let's talk about some of those. First off, honeybees have a bunch of different diseases. They are facing their own series of threats. They can carry all sorts of different diseases. One of the biggest ones that we see in honeybees is called deformed wing virus, or DWV, and it's exactly like it sounds like. So it makes the wings of adult bees, when they finish pupating, they emerge and they don't have proper wings. These bees will never be able to fly. Their wings are deformed, they are crumpled, they are small. A lot of times they also have a really small, kind of messed up looking abdomen, and these bees are sick. And they can spread this from bee to bee within the colony And they can spread this from colony to colony as they're interacting with one another and robbing honey from one another, like they do really like to do. So honeybees can carry all sorts of different diseases, and a lot of the research is starting to show us that these diseases are spreading over into our native bee populations. For example, deformed wing virus is a really common one that's now found in a lot of our bumblebees, especially in areas with high densities of honeybees. There is a really beautiful graphic, and this is where I so wish that we had a video podcast going so I could show you all this diagram. But if you want to go and find this, there is an article in the journal Pathogens, and the title is Pathogen Spillover from Honeybees to Other Arthropods by Nanetti et al.
We'll also probably put it in our Instagram post after the episode is posted.
Oh yeah, we totally should. So on the right side of this diagram is like 20-something different viruses that honeybees can have. And on the left are all different groups of arthropods. The biggest one that we're seeing is bombus, and that's because bumblebees are really closely related to honeybees. And so you can see that the majority of the pathogens that honeybees have are being able to be spilled over into our native bumblebees. But there's wasps, there are spiders, there are all sorts of other arthropods where honeybees are now literally transmitting different pathogens to our native insects and other arthropods.
I didn't know that they passed them on to spiders. Oh, that's like so interesting, but also like, oh no.
So this is one of the biggest issues with honeybees and beekeeping in North America. One, people are doing it because they're being told that there's a pollination deficit, and so they need to be putting out these non-native pollinators to pollinate things, I guess.
Ugh.
But also, these bees are transmitting all these different pathogens everywhere they go. One researcher who is doing some really cool work with pathogen spillover from honeybees is Samantha Alger up at the University of Vermont. She's been looking at how honeybees are able to spread pathogens from different flower structures, and how flowers are viral hotspots for honeybees to spread these viruses to one another and to other species. So I would highly recommend also checking out some of her papers because there's some really cool research coming out of her lab. Another thing is that honeybees can very quickly outcompete our native pollinators. So to kind of explain how and why this happens, I want to talk a little bit about a honeybee colony versus one of our native eusocial bees like a bumblebee colony versus the majority of our native bee species, which is a solitary bee. A strong honeybee colony will have anywhere from 30,000 to 80,000 individuals. Most of our native bumblebee colonies have between 50 to 500 bees at the peak of their season, and a solitary bee, like we learned about earlier in this episode, just has one adult bee working their nest. For honeybees, a queen can lay up to 1,500 eggs per day. Bumblebees, the research is kind of varied. It was hard to get a number on this actually, but it's maybe somewhere around 8 to 12 eggs every few days.
Just a little different. Just a little.
And for a solitary bee, many of these species really only lay 20 to 30 eggs in their entire lifetime. Stark differences here. Mm-hmm. For honeybees, they hoard honey. A honeybee colony can produce anywhere from like 10 to 200 or even more pounds of honey in just a single year. And this is because a honeybee colony overwinters as an entire colony. So for those winter months, there are no flowers. But the colony is still active and alive, and they actually keep that colony warm to around 96, 97 degrees Fahrenheit for the entirety of the winter. They cluster around each other, vibrate their wing muscles, and keep that colony warm so that way they can protect the queen and make sure that she can start laying eggs again in the spring. So because they are constantly exerting energy, they need to also be getting energy and getting carbohydrates and calories from something. So they hoard all this honey in their colony so that way they can eat it throughout the winter when there's not other available food sources. They're really the only species that does this, at least in North America. Bumblebees will store very little honey, so they do make these cute little honey pots, but it really only lasts them a day or two. They're not hoarding 200 pounds of honey, which is nectar, in their colony. And for bumblebees, only inseminated queens will overwinter. And then for our solitary bees, they're only collecting pollen, sometimes even pollen from just specific plant sources, right? And some nectar in order to provision their brood cells. And then that brood will overwinter in various forms in whatever nest that they've made, in a cavity, in the ground, in a hollow stem. They're not hoarding any honey either. And so you can see if there's very little available floral resources in a certain space, and you have even just one honeybee colony, they can very quickly outcompete these native species because they are hoarding that honey.
Yeah, and they also have like really advanced communication with one another. So even other like eusocial species like bumblebees, they're not necessarily finding flowers, coming home and being like, "Hey girls, come with me. Let's go hang out on these flowers." But
Right, it's like every bee for her own.
right. But honeybees do that. They come home and like I think a lot of us have heard of the honeybee dance where they do a little dance to tell their sisters where all of the best flowers are and then they will all go to that flower patch. So again, as Casey was saying, if there's limited floral resources in the area and a whole colony of these thousands of bees is going over to just sort of take all of the resources they can, that leaves very little for the many other species that really require them.
Exactly. Also, honeybees are able to travel very far from their colony in order to forage. They've been documented foraging like 7 miles or around 11 kilometers away from their nest. Whereas, like we talked about, a lot of bumblebee species kind of travel around like a kilometer around their nest. And many of these solitary species only travel around 100 meters or so. So, very stark differences in how far these bees are able to travel in order to find enough forage as well.
And that's why a lot of these city beekeeping programs are not so great. So I think a lot of people have seen like those rooftop apiaries and things like that. And again, it's being sold as this idea of like, oh, we're increasing the amount of pollinators in the landscape. But cities, unfortunately, I mean, while they might have a good diversity of flowers because people have gardens, the abundance of flowers is much less than you'd find in rural areas. So if you're flooding this area that has a very low abundance of flowers with this one species, sometimes like multiple colonies all on one rooftop that are then expanding all throughout the entire city. Imagine these other native species that are really struggling to get the amount of resources they need to keep themselves alive and to raise their babies, then having to compete with these brought in, much more aggressive pollinators.
And the rule of thumb in beekeeping is that for every colony that you put out into the landscape, that colony is going to need about an entire acre of blossoming trees, shrubs, and flower in order to support it. So that's just one colony. So if you're putting 20, 30, 50, however many out there, you are going to really overload that system with that single honeybee species.
It's kind of like any type of livestock. Like a horse needs a big field to run around in. Like a single horse needs a really big field. It's the same thing here. Like a single hive needs a lot of area to fly around in and forage in. It may seem like a very small commitment because it's this little box, but they're very far flying. And so you need to think about, where they're going, not just where they're living and sleeping.
Exactly. It's also really interesting because there's even some towns, like there's towns in Texas that will subsidize you getting honeybees. So you'll literally get money in order to get a honeybee hive. And it's just such backwards thinking. Like you're not doing anything to really actually benefit pollinators or the ecosystem.
Yeah.
So while honeybees are not going to really benefit the ecosystem in many ways, they are important agricultural animals. Like I mentioned, they are so intricately intertwined with the agricultural system in the United States and elsewhere that we really rely on them for their pollination services at this time. We ship them all around the United States, so honeybees might start in a facility in like Maine or North Dakota, and then they get packed up in their colonies onto these giant Mack trucks, and they get shipped all around the US for the pollination of different crops. Almond pollination is one of the biggest ones. Hundreds of thousands of colonies are brought over to California for about a 2-week period for just the almond bloom. So these are acres and acres and acres of rows and rows and rows of just almond trees. And so when these are in bloom, they bring in a bunch of honeybee colonies, and those honeybees are going to do what honeybees do, and they're going to forage and collect pollen and collect nectar, and the only thing that's available to them are those almond blossoms. And so they visit those, they pollinate the almonds, and then once the blooms are done, they get packed back up, shipped off to the next location to pollinate something else. And then in a handful of months, they come on back to where they will overwinter in their, like, quote-unquote native area. And this is also where, you know, we're seeing a lot of potential for diseases to spread, right? As these bees are getting shipped all around, they're going to be interacting with different species that might be occurring at the edges of these monoculture fields and spreading diseases from place to place as they move through the environment. All that being said, we are incredibly dependent on this one single species of bee.
And again, one of the big reasons we have to depend on this one species to pollinate our crops is because of what we talked about before. These are large monocultures that have very few other flowering species growing between them, which means that they're not supporting a wide diversity of other pollinator species. So there is a pollination deficit in these areas because of the lack of pollinator diversity and activity that would happen normally in this native range, but because of the way that we manage crops in this country, it's just not really possible, hence why we ship in the honeybees.
Right. Nothing can penetrate into, you know, acres and acres of a crop that only blooms for 2 weeks out of the entire year.
Exactly.
So we do lack pollinators in these systems, but probably not in your backyard.
No.
One thing that really irks me is that the honeybee is almost always the, like, poster child for the Save the Bees campaign. And it's just so frustrating because we can manage honeybees as livestock animals, so we can reproduce them, we can manage them. While honeybees do face their own threats, and they are important agricultural livestock animals, they are not the bees that are in trouble. It's our native species that are of conservation concern, where we need to be looking at protecting them and helping them overcome some of these threats.
Yeah, like honeybees are not going to disappear. I often use a comparison of, you know, when our eggs got really expensive not too long ago because of avian flu and chicken populations. This was because they were losing a lot of chickens, and so we had, you know, not as many eggs. But chickens were never going to go extinct because we are constantly breeding them. And it's the same with honeybees. Because they are a livestock species that is heavily managed by humans, they're never actually going to go extinct.
Right. And also because they are so important to agriculture and to crop production, there is a lot of money and research that goes towards them.
Yes.
I often tell people, if you want to save the bees and you get a honeybee hive, that's equivalent to saying, oh, I've heard that migratory songbirds are declining. I want to save these birds. And then you get a flock of chickens.
Yeah.
It doesn't quite equate, right?
Yeah.
So again, these are important agricultural animals, but they're not part of the conservation conversation.
And as much as we're saying that, you know, honeybees are not of conservation concern and they are this managed livestock species, and you've heard us say a lot of things about how they affect these critters in the environment, they are really culturally important to humans in a variety of ways. And we don't want, you know, what we're saying to distract from that fact. We know that they're very beloved by humans and have their place in our world.
Exactly. And, you know, if you have honeybees, we're not trying to shame you for that, but we would like to make you a little bit more aware of the potential threats that beekeeping can have on your native pollinator communities, because as someone who might be managing these insects, you need to be aware of that and to mitigate that as best you can. If you're going to keep honeybees, make sure that you're doing it for the right reasons. Don't get honeybees in order to save the bees, because now we know that that's not going to do anything to help the bees that are actually at risk and declining. You also probably shouldn't get honeybees if you are being told that they're going to help the pollinator deficit out there. You should be doing other things to help the native pollinators that are already in your landscape and in your garden before you start introducing non-native species. But if you want to get honeybees because beekeeping is really important to you, it's, your parents did it, your grandparents did it, that's a valid reason. If you want to beekeep because you want wax products to make candles, that's a valid reason. If you want honey to sell at your roadside farm stand, that's a valid reason. And if you have a farm where you have really dense crops that are planted and you know that your fruit set isn't as good as it could be, and you're going to get a hive or two in order to help those pollination services on your farm, that's a valid reason. Again, make sure that if you get into beekeeping, that you're doing it for the right reasons, but also make sure that you are responsibly beekeeping. Do all of your research ahead of time. You wouldn't go out and buy chickens or buy goats or horses without doing research and knowing all of the potential risks that could come with them, the costs associated with them, the diseases that they could have or spread. And so you just want to make sure that you are doing your proper research into these animals before you get them. And if you are going to beekeep, please make sure that you are continuously monitoring and treating for varroa mites. But if you're beekeeping and you don't know what a varroa mite is, you shouldn't be beekeeping.
Yeah.
And that is going to be my hot take on that.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And some great ways you can be a responsible beekeeper include registering your hive, asking for regular inspections, joining a beekeeping group so that you can stay up to date with the latest research and inspection techniques.
Have an established beekeeper mentor.
Yes, absolutely. And we know a lot of really good responsible beekeepers, and we have a lot of beekeepers who follow us on this podcast and are really interested and invested in native bee conservation as well. This is an issue that we share. And one, if you're keeping insects, it probably means you like insects. So I think instead of there being sort of a hero villain sort of dynamic here, we should all just be working together to take care of all of our species.
Right, exactly. There are ways to do things where you are going to mitigate those potential negative consequences that honeybees can have. There's right ways to do things, there's wrong ways to do things, and hopefully, if you are doing it in the wrong way, this is now going to be the message that you get in order to maybe instill some better beekeeping practices and instill some better animal husbandry into your hobby or your business. Also, honeybees can be really cool because they're kind of like a gateway bug. Yeah, they're a bit of a gateway bug into native pollinators. I know for me personally, I actually got into bee research because I was working with honeybees first. I worked with honeybee hives for many, many years. And then I took a step away and I started to get a little bit more fascinated and intrigued by our native bee species. And learned more about how the beekeeping industry can potentially negatively impact our native species. And I got a little bit more into that. For people who are hobby beekeepers, I hear all the time from them that, they started out just getting a hive or two in their backyard, but then they wanted to watch their bees more, or they knew that their bees needed more food, and so they planted more flowers, and then they got into diversity of flowers, and then they started noticing the bumblebees on the flowers and the other bees, and now they're seeing these green sweat bees on the flowers, and they can name some of these native species that are out there. They're putting more forage out into the landscape for native species and their honeybees, and it really can be this really beautiful kind of transition from beekeeping into native bee conservation. So it's a gray scale. It's not black or white. You can have both.
I love that unintentional pun in there. Can be.
I didn't even pick up on that. While our native bees are facing a multitude of threats, and many of their populations are declining or becoming more restricted in their range, there are luckily a lot of things that we can do to protect these native species of bees and other beneficial insects in the environment. So let's talk about a few of those to close out this episode. One of the biggest things that you can do is plant native flowers. These are going to be flowers that are native to your region in particular, and there are so many resources online. We're going to link a few in the episode description, mainly the Xerces Society, who has some regional native plant lists, but that's just a jumping off point. Find your local native plant society or local nonprofits. I bet you're going to find some really great resources there to help you. If you're in the Northeastern or New England area, the Native Plant Trust's Native Plant Finder is one of my personal favorites. It's a really cool website where you can say the region that you're in. You can even specify that you want orange flowers that are less than 3 feet, that are perennials, and it's going to give you a list of plants that are native to your region that fit that criteria. So if you're being really particular, that's a really cool one. But that one is mostly just for the Northeast or New England.
I love that tool. I've used it so many times.
It's one of my favorites. Also, when you're planting flowers, you want to make sure that you are planting a diversity of flowers. So this doesn't just mean diversity of species, but we also need a diversity of color, of flower structure, so what the flowers kind of look like, as well as the bloom time. You want to aim for having continuous blooms throughout the season. So here in New England, our main growing season is like April to October. Those are kind of the hard edges there when we start to have snow. And so you want to try to have spring blooming flowers, transitional flowers going into the summer, all the way through the fall, because different insects come out at different times. They have different phenologies and different life cycles. And so you want to try to have blooms year-round, at least through the growing season. Now, bees don't just need food. In addition to food, bees also need proper shelter. We learned about how some of these bees nest in this episode, so they need access to untilled soil. You might want to restrict heavy mulching or plastic tarping because of this, especially if your garden space is surrounded by compact turf. Some bees are really good diggers, but they're not good enough at digging through really compact turf. And then, if they go to your garden bed, where there's some nice soil, but there's 3 inches of mulch on top of it, they're going to have a really hard time digging down through that mulch or accessing the soil. So trying to make some spaces where, you're not tilling every year for your crop production, you're not covering with plastic tarping. That's a really great way to provide access to the ground, which is what a lot of our bees need in order to nest.
Especially as we mentioned before, in a heavily paved world, any bit of dirt that they can get into, untilled, unmulched dirt, is really a wonderful resource for them.
And remember, a lot of these ground nesting bees and wasps are solitary nesting. Obviously, like ground nesting yellow jackets or maybe bumblebees that use abandoned rodent burrows are going to be a little bit of a different case. But for the most part, these ground nesting bees are solitary and they are not really going to be defensive at all. So if they find a location in your lawn where they really like the substrate there, they're going to keep nesting there year after year. But they're only going to be there for a couple weeks, maybe a month at the most, and they're really not going to be defensive unless you purposefully go ahead and grab one and hold it in your hands.
Yep. I feel like I get a lot of people getting worried about the eastern cicada killer because they're so large, and people assume because they're so large, they must be super aggressive. And no, they're gentle giants. So even if you see a big, scary looking wasp going into a hole in the ground in your lawn, it's still just a chill wasp that doesn't want to sting you.
I just maybe wouldn't log roll through their nesting aggregation in case you roll over one and then she thinks that you're going to squish her. So
yeah.
Don't go log rolling through fields of ground nesting insects.
Advice of the day.
And you'll be fine. For our twig nesting species, you can choose to plant plants that have hollow stems or soft pithy stems. So again, things like monarda, mountain mints, Blackberries and other similar brambles, those have hollow stems that these bees will use. Now, if you need to clean up your garden, in the springtime, if you still have flowers with the seed heads on them, you can cut those back to about 12 to 24 inches high and then just let them naturally decompose. By cutting off the seed head, you're going to allow the bees to access those hollow stems because they otherwise wouldn't really be able to get in there with the seed head still on there, right? And then by leaving that in your garden, those bees will be able to utilize that nest and it's going to just naturally decompose. And it's not going to be, an 8-foot high stalk that is all wonky, that your neighbors are screaming at. You're going to keep them down low to about a foot or two high. And that's going to provide that nesting site. That's going to be a natural space for these bees to nest in and overwinter in.
And it's great to wait until the early spring to do this because then birds also have access to that wonderful seed head all through the winter. And then in the spring, when you go to clean up your garden, then you can trim them back and make them habitat for bees. So, yay, you're supporting everybody.
And then in the summer and early fall, you might have new bees making nests in those stems. So you don't want to cut them back further once you have already cut them to that 12 to 24 inches height. Just let them hang out, and it's okay if your garden's messy. And I'm about to tell you how to keep your garden even messier. So, in the fall, when all of the leaves drop from the trees, instead of bagging all of those leaves up and throwing them away, use them as free compost. Rake those leaves into garden beds or around shrubs. You don't need to leave them over your turf grass if you really like your lawn, because obviously that's going to probably kill your grass. But by raking them into your garden beds around shrubs, you're going to provide some habitat for different overwintering insects, like queen bumblebees or pupating moths and butterflies. Allowing some leaf litter to remain is a really great way to protect insects over the winter. This includes things like fireflies, too.
I always like to think of leaving the leaves, especially when you put them into your garden beds, as like tucking in your plants for the winter.
Yeah.
I definitely use it to like insulate some of the roots of, especially some of my herbs that are a little bit more sensitive to hard freezes. And I find that it really helps them survive the winter. So again, you're getting that dual benefit. And with everything that Casey just described, I do find that people love like a quick whippy thing to remember. So like leave the leaves obviously is a really nice like hashtag almost. But with all of this, the two phrases I like to sort of hone in on is when you're thinking about what you're planting, think variety is the spice of life. And when you think about providing habitat, think embrace the mess. So variety is the spice of life, embrace the mess. And if you're following that with how you're managing your property, like you're probably doing a pretty good job.
And there's also so many ways to show people that that space is still being taken care of, right?
Yes.
You haven't just let it go to chaos. You're like, even though it's messy, it's on purpose and it's for a reason.
Yes.
And so there are different signs that you can buy or even make yourself to try to help educate your neighbors if you think they're going to be a little bit grumpy about seeing leaves and stems, which is, a whole other cultural movement that we need to talk about one day.
Oh my gosh, yes.
but those cues to care are so important to show people that the space is still being cared for and that this is done on purpose, so that way they don't think that it's just you being really, really messy. Which maybe it's that too, but that's, your own thing to deal with.
That's a great phrase, Casey. Cues to care. I'm going to use that.
And one of the last things that you can do to support native bees and other beneficial insects is just educate yourself and educate others. So you are already doing one of the steps to help support native species by listening to this right now. I hope you've learned at least one new thing. If you already knew a lot about native bees, maybe you didn't know that there were 20,000 different species of bees in the world and that they all nest differently. Or maybe you didn't know that 90% of bee species are solitary nesting. Or that we even have bees that nest in stems. That's wild. Not that many people know that. By educating yourself, you're also able to then teach other people. Talk to your friends, talk to your family, talk to your neighbors that are grouchy about why you're leaving the leaves this year. Help to educate them on native pollinators and how insect conservation is so important for the ecosystem.
I love that. And I mean, I think that it's a great point of connection sometimes. Like one of our neighbors mows our lawn because our lawnmower broke this year, and she's started leaving big patches in the shape of a heart in on my
Oh.
lawn because she knows that I care about native pollinators, and she's seen like my native meadow that I've installed, and she's seen my herb garden, and because we've had these conversations, she's like, "Oh, when I mow their lawn, I'm gonna leave this big heart patch for the bees."
Oh my gosh. No, that's so sweet. And it's like, I love seeing moments like that happen at our lab. We have about like 85 acres where I work. And the grounds crew from the university have been learning more about pollinators and native plants and what's good and what's bad. And so actually when they mow, they'll oftentimes like mow around dense patches of like clover in the lawn that's
Oh,
blooming. Or we have this really big patch of yarrow, Achillea millefolium, that's blooming right now, and they've
I
been
love
mowing
that.
around it to leave it. And it's just like so heartwarming to see that. And a couple years ago, they wouldn't do it. They would have just mowed the whole thing down. So it's really cool to see, like, just having these little conversations with people, whether they are, a grounds crew or your local HOA or your neighbor or your parents or your sister, whoever it might be, like having these conversations might make them change just one thing, and maybe that one thing is really just like the jumping off point to get their minds kind of thinking about the impacts of what they're doing, and hopefully they'll be able to approach things with a little bit more curiosity in the future.
Absolutely. And I mean, this is a great example of how supporting and building strong interspecies communities is a way to become a better human neighbor as well. So seeing these not as, you know, fighting points, but as opportunities for connection.
Yes.
Thank you all for joining us for another episode of Frass Happens. Today's topic is one that was very near and dear to our hearts, so we really appreciate you listening.
Thank you so much. Before we go, we wanted to give a quick shout out to our first supporter on buymeacoffee.com. This week, we got a notification that 50 millipedes in a trench coat had bought us a coffee, which completely made our day and made us cackle pretty hard.
We laughed for so long. So, 50 millipedes in a trench coat. We love you and your many, many legs. Thank you for your support. And for anyone else who's interested in supporting us in a monetary capacity, if that's something that you're able to do, you can also buy us a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/FrassHappensPodcast. We'd love to give you a shout out on the podcast as well.
And finally, by the time that this episode airs, we will have stickers available for you to purchase.
I'm so excited.
I am so excited. Katie just got them in the mail the other day and they look amazing.
They look so good.
Shout out to my friend Alyssa who designed them. She is such an incredible artist and we are so excited to share her artwork and some of these stickers for Frass Happens with you.
Yee!
To purchase stickers, visit our website at frasshappenspodcast.com and check out our brand new merch store. And please send us pictures of you with your stickers. We want to see them out in the world. We want to see Frass Happens on your water bottle, on your computers, wherever you might be putting them. I cannot wait.
And I don't want to like encourage you to vandalize, but like put these stickers everywhere. Do it. Do it.
And as always, if you enjoy listening to Frass Happens, please like, comment, review, and follow us wherever you listen to podcasts. And we'll see you again in 2 weeks with our next episode.
Okay. Love you. Bye.
Be nice to bugs!